Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited to bring the conversation I had with Agnes Callard. Agnes is a philosopher and associate professor of philosophy and director of undergraduate studies at the University of Chicago. She has a bachelor's from the University of Chicago and a PhD from Berkeley. Her primary research areas are in ancient philosophy and ethics. She's written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Atlantic, Harper's, and many other outlets. And she is the author of many books, including her latest, Open Socrates, The Case for a Philosophical Life, which we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about generally philosophical life and Socrates. We talk about untimely questions, what they are, and how they are juxtaposed with timely questions. We have a nice exchange about intellectual intimacy, savage commands, Socratic ethics, truth inquiries, living a philosophical life, and many more topics. I've wanted to talk to Agnes on the podcast for quite some time. I was very, very happy that she came on, and her book is fantastic. I also really encourage her pieces that she writes. She has some of these long form pieces in the outlets I had just mentioned, and some of them are also quite good. And so you can really see some of the evolution of her ideas. You can see how she thinks through things. She is one of the best case examples I can think of doing philosophy in modern life. She is just really, really fantastic. Her book's great. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. Also on YouTube, like, subscribe, share, contribute. All those things are much appreciated. And now I bring you Agnes Callard. I am here with Agnes Callard. Agnes, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's very nice to have you on my many voices that have been on the podcast. I'm happy to have you join that list. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for reading my book.
Oh yeah. Well, your book was great. I had heard about it, and some people had been posting about it, and then I said okay, and so I was able to get a copy, and I read it, and I really enjoyed it. The book is Open Socrates: The Case for a Philosophical Life, which I will absolutely co-sign. We all should have that. So you really tackle many philosophical concepts in a very thoughtful and yet pragmatic way, and so it's a very readable book, but it's also not dumbed down too much. It's a really nice mix. I really enjoyed that kind of sweet spot you hit. So we'll talk all about it. Before we do, just give listeners a kind of snapshot of who you are.
My name is Agnes Callard. I'm a philosopher. I teach at the University of Chicago. My sort of training is in ancient philosophy and sort of contemporary ethics and moral psychology. And in the past, 7 years or so, I've sort of turned to do a lot of public philosophy.
Why the turn? You wanted to have a bigger reach for people, and you didn't want to just talk to philosophy professors forever. You wanted to talk to the public, yeah? What was the big major motivator?
It wasn't. It didn't happen in this conscious way where I had a single moment where I'm I'm going to become a public philosopher. I think that actually the thing that started the turn was becoming a DUS, Director of Undergraduate Studies in my department, which means I run the undergrad program in philosophy.
Okay.
And it's not a particularly elevated job. It's not a job anybody wants, but I actually really love it. I'm still DUS. I'm secretly conspiring to be DUS for life. And having that job got me thinking about not just sort of how do I present philosophy to my own students, but how do I present it to the whole body of students in such a way as to draw those students who haven't already bought in to the value, significance, interest of philosophy. And so I started designing events that were supposed to appeal to students who aren't necessarily philosophy majors, who aren't necessarily ever going to take a philosophy class. I'm still, you can have philosophy in your life, and I can show you how. And then that sort of fed into doing some writing along those lines. And I think I found just by doing it that I turned out to be good at it. That is, I wouldn't sort of have predicted it. Like it's not, it was sort of something recurring in my life from high school. So in high school, you have to like apply to college. And when you apply to college, you write college admissions essays. Okay. So I was amazing at college admissions essays. And so that was like my secret forte. Mine were fantastically good. I ended up getting a full scholarship to the University of Chicago solely on the strength of my admissions essays. Right? That's how good I was at college admissions essays. It turns out that was not, sort of disappointingly for me, it was not like a further marketable skill, right? In the many years that followed, I was good at this thing, but like life does not involve a lot of college admissions occasions, right? It involves exactly one. So I had this skill that was perfectly suited to this one occasion. And then I just kind of put it aside. And I actually found that when I started trying to write like public philosophy, it was that part of me woke up. I was like, oh, this is kind of like college admissions essays. And that's when I like reactivated my secret superpower for writing college admissions essays.
It's actually kind of neat that you say that, because I remember reading this book, and I read a lot of things, and I remember thinking like, I mean, people write well typically. If you're going to be published, more or less, some editors have looked at it at least. But I remember this was very well like synthesized. It was well written. I was like, man, this is like very integrated. Like you can tell, obviously, you thought about these things for a while, but it was just written very, very well, and it's definitely noticeable, right? So the thing that you're saying, maybe this like kind of skill you have, this is. It was noticeable. It even reading a lot, the writing in a good way stood out in the book. So it's great. It definitely is noticeable.
Thank you.
Let me just ask one question here. I've always kind of thought this. So I mean, I'm adjunct, but I teach grad students, and I always say that for people like young people coming out of high school, if they say like, yeah, I don't really know what I want to do. I want to go to college, 4-year degree, but I don't know. Maybe I don't know what to do. And I always tell folks, look, outside of like the gen ed classes you have to take, I always say a good bachelor's degree is, maybe English lit or something. But I always say like a philosophy degree is usually pretty good. You know how to read everything. You know how to write well. You know how to like analyze. You know how to critique. You know how to synthesize. You read everything, in theory. I mean, so as the director of undergrad studies, I mean, you're going to have very biased, I'm sure, but what's the like, I guess, selling point there of like, yeah, this is why this is still good to do, even if you go and you work for fill in the blank, finance on Wall Street, nonprofit, government, but like having a bachelor's in philosophy, from a good, accredited program, et cetera. What's like, I guess, for in your mind, the case for that for kind of young people?
Yeah. So I have an essay that I wrote a while ago for The Point. It's one of my earlier essays called Against Advice. And what I say in that essay is that a lot of, let's say, the kind of advice that's typically given online, where some kind of celebrity of one kind or another sort of like tells people like how to live their lives or how to become them, or that I think I'm very skeptical of that. I think you can't really give people advice unless you know those people, like at least a little bit. So most advice is useless. And so I think it actually follows that like, if I were to try to give you a general statement of like, why should you be a philosophy major? That's a little bit like generic advice.
Sure.
And that's not actually how I approach the project of presenting the philosophy major to the campus. I don't try to tell them what they're going to get out of being a philosophy major. What I try to do is just show them some philosophy. So like, here's an event. We're going to be talking about philosophy of sex, philosophy of divorce, economics versus philosophy, which is better? And maybe you're interested in that question, and then you want to come to the event. And when you're at the event, it spurs questions in you that you want to ask, and you start to see what's interesting. And I guess it's like a kind of show versus tell thing. That the best way of showing people the value of philosophy is actually showing them the value of philosophy rather than talking about things they're going to get out of philosophy. And an interesting advantage, I think, that philosophy, I think the same thing is true of literature, really. Like, why should you read novels, right? It's like, well, read the novels and you'll find out. But the difficulty is, like, the novels are long sometimes, right? And so it's like, why should you read a long Tolstoy novel? Do I have to get through the whole novel before I know? With philosophy, you can often present things in a relatively pithy way. You can often do it in a couple of minutes. And so there isn't some like huge buy-in. That's a big advantage of philosophy and sort of its peculiar corner of the humanities.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I also agree with you and on the advice piece, but I would say that I think a lot of the times people don't know what philosophy looks like. And people think it's just you read papers, you read a bunch of old dead guys, and you write some books on it and give your commentary. And I think if you show people like, well, this is actually what it looks like in kind of daily living, it's like, oh, well, that's actually not too bad, or wow, I could maybe do that, or that's really cool, or And I think that kind of the whole Bandura thing, like the observational learning. People see how it's modeled and things like that, and it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of cool, And so having good folks like yourself. I mean, the guy that comes to mind is Simon Critchley, and maybe you know him or whatever it is. He tries to do this as well, and I think that can be really helpful. So for the book, you start out with the question of why am I doing all of this? Anything, life, all these things I'm doing. That's the question we're kind of avoiding, and you kind of give us these two figures, Tolstoy, who I love. I love Tolstoy.
Me too.
And Socrates, of course. He's the after the book, and I believe his sort of image is on the cover, I guess.
Sort of.
And they have different approaches to understanding life. Tolstoy wants to avoid the why questions. Kind of this, in this stereotypical Russian way. It's going to just lead me to this dark place, and what am I going to do? And then the kind of Socrates is like, let's just run headfirst into it and figure it out and ask all these questions. So you kind of give this juxtaposition. Yeah. So why I guess are we afraid to ask that question of like, why am I doing it? Why are we doing this podcast? Why am I waking up tomorrow going to work? Why am I all those things? Why are we kind of afraid of that?
So I think it's not exactly that we're afraid of them. I think that the reason we don't pose those questions to ourselves is actually that we can't. That is, it's not possible for us to pose them to ourselves. So what Tolstoy sort of discovered was that there was a thing that he had to do, that it was necessary for him to do, that he couldn't do. Namely, there was a set of questions that were the most important, the most foundational questions, which you couldn't really go on living if you didn't give answers to those questions. And he couldn't do it, right? And so he found himself suicidal. And his solution was like, just try to find a way to close those questions and to sort of walk away from them. Because that way madness lies. Socrates, in a way, is not disagreeing with any of that, except for that he did find a way to inquire into those questions, not by posing them to himself. I think he would just grant to Tolstoy, you're right, that's impossible. But you can inquire into the questions by posing them to someone else or by having that person pose them to you. So there's a set of questions about our lives that we can only inquire into with the help of other people. And we're constantly trying to do it by ourselves and constantly finding that we're hitting a wall. The reason why we can't inquire into these questions by ourselves, I call them untimely questions. And the reason they're untimely is because they come at the wrong time. They come after you've already answered them. Usually, you're supposed to have the question first and then the answer. But these questions are in the wrong order. Answer comes first. And the problem is that if you think you have the answer to a question, any question, doesn't matter what question, if you think you have the answer, you cannot ask the question. As long as you hold on to that answer, you can't ask it. You could pretend. Suppose I'm like, am I talking to Javier right now? Am I talking to Javier right now? Like I could say it. I can I can mouth the words and I can inflect it at the end as though it were a question, but I'm not actually asking myself the question. I know that I am, right? So I can't ask it. I can only pretend to ask it. Now, with most questions, even if we might have a provisional answer or a guess at an answer, we might also just be able to say, yeah, that's what I'm inclined to think is the answer, but let me suspend judgment on that. Let me pretend that I don't give that answer. let me suppose that it's the wrong answer. We can make those moves, right? If you make those moves, then you no longer think you have an answer, then you can ask the question. But with this special subset of questions, untimely questions, you can't make any of those moves. That is, you always think you have the answer and you can't suspend judgment and you think it every time and you don't think that that's the wrong answer. So you're holding on to the answer. You're like clutching it for dear life. Kind of literally for dear life, because it's the answer that's guiding your life. And so you're stuck. You can't pose it to yourself, but you can pose it to someone else and see what they're going to say.
Isn't there, risks isn't the right word, but aren't there potential downsides once you bring another actor or person or, involved? If you're asking questions and all of a sudden you're going to bring somebody else into the picture, one or multiple people, well, then you're going to get different ideas, right? Isn't that you're asking for more variables to answer a question. Doesn't that pose, there's some advantages I can imagine, but aren't there going to pose some challenges to that as well? What is the kind of push-pull there?
So this reminds me of like a meme that I sometimes see online where someone's like, okay, Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living, but the examined life is worth living, right? Socrates never says that. He never says the examined life is worth living. He only says the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, but let's say you came to Socrates and you're like, yeah, but there are lots of downsides to examination. It might be unpleasant, it might be difficult, you might not get anywhere, you might get killed for it. Like, what about all the downsides? And Socrates will be like, yeah, but I just told you, the unexamined life is not worth living. It doesn't matter what we think about the examined life. It doesn't matter whether we think it can get you anywhere ever. That's what you should do if you know the unexamined life is not worth living. So similarly, if you know that you cannot make any progress at all these questions by yourself, then it doesn't matter how many disadvantages other people introduce. Beggars can't be choosers. And you are thrown onto the generosity of the people around you. You're kind of desperate. And Socrates presents himself that way to the people around him. I'm a desperate man. I need your help. Without your help, I can't think. That is, my mind doesn't work by itself. It only works with your help. So even though there might be a lot of downsides to you, you might be very arrogant. You might be officious. You might be planning to kill me later. You might just be wanting to make fun of me. You might have no intention of doing any real philosophy. There might be lots of problems with you. There are lots of problems with all the people Socrates talks to. He's like, well, those are the people I've got, so I got to make it work with them.
So it's a very social component, right? The social aspect is the line of looking at what the unexamined life is, right? It's that piece of it.
Yeah, it's a thesis of the book that thinking is a social activity. It's not something that can take place in your head.
I'll come back to that. But tell us about these untimely questions. So maybe make a delineation here between like what would be, not necessarily a timely question, but what would be things that would be, you don't have to spend time on definitions per se, but like, for example, if I were to ask like, I'll take a big one. You talk about it later in the book, but like, does this person love me? Right? Does this person love me? Like, I don't know that answer. I think I know that answer, but I don't actually know if that person does. Maybe we've never talked, or maybe I've never asked them that, right? Like, maybe it's somebody that like, it's somebody I've only kind of met with or something. I'm like, do they really feel that strongly? Or maybe they don't. Or let's say it's somebody I'm not close with or I'm not intimate with or whatever. All these different kind of levels. How you can't really know that, right? And you, even if you ask, you still have to rely on what the person's saying, or what they show you, or how you interpret it, what your perception is. But is that an example? I mean, that's a big question, right? You have to, what's love and what is the other person, all these things. But is that an example of something like that, or what would be an example of untimely, and then all the other kinds of questions, I guess?
So that's not a clear-cut example of a timely question, because I think we typically ask whether somebody loves us when we're in a situation where we care a lot whether they love us, and in fact, we've kind of been presupposing that they love us, or we care a lot whether they love us, and it's kind of pretty important to us to get the result that they don't love us. That's when we tend to ask the question, and so our inquiries into that question tend to show all the flaws of this kind of impossible inquiry. So let me. I don't want to deny that you could possibly ask it in a timely way. I'm just saying typically it's not going to be.
Okay.
But like, just say you have to make any decision about what to do.
Okay.
Should I go out to a movie? Should I cook dinner at home or go out? Should I take a vacation? Most of the time when we ask ourselves those questions, we haven't decided what the answer is before we ask them to ourselves, right? I might be genuinely uncertain whether to take a certain vacation. And I'm sort of like, well, I make a list of pros and cons, say, and then I decide, okay, I should take it, right? That's really not what, like, does she love me feels like, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't feel with that. It's like, does she love me because she's better? Or does she love me because I'm sure she doesn't, and she's not going to feel bad if I go with someone else, whatever, right? So timely questions are questions that come before the answer, where we genuinely don't think that we know the answer as we're asking ourselves the question. And there are many, many questions like that. I mean, informational questions are like that. There's something I want to know and I look it up online. I don't already think I have the answer, so why I look it up. So there are practical timely questions and there are theoretical timely questions where I'm looking for information, right? That's, a lot of questions are like that. And so in the case of a lot of questions, it's perfectly fine to inquire by yourself.
I guess the question I'm really asking here is like, what are the stakes of it, right? Should I go to Domino's or should I go to Pizza Hut, right? Or maybe I don't go to either or, right? Maybe I go to somewhere else. Maybe I go to Noodles and Company. I don't know. Those feel not consequential, but like who I choose as a life partner, or do I feel this person's loyal to me, or do I trust them, or bigger things,
Do I make a really big career move or that kind of thing, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. These feel
Do I have kids?
of consequence, right? Do I have kids? Do I not have kids? Like those are big questions, right?
Yeah.
Like, do we put a kind of weight on things that are bigger questions that are bigger versus what am I going to have for lunch today? Is it going to be, whatever? Like there is a kind of weighted system here, no?
So I even think that there's some psychological research on this, that when people have to make really big decisions, they do less like explicit, like cost benefit analysis reasoning and stuff than when they have to decide where to take a vacation or whatever. And I think that's because we struggle to make the really big decisions, because with the really big decisions, we feel like we ought to know in advance what the answer is. So if I'm like, should I marry him? Should I have kids? Should I radically change my career? I don't feel like I can go into that with, look, I have no idea. I'm completely open. Kids or no kids, marriage or no marriage. Let me just list pros and cons. And then at the end of it, I'll just go with the longer list.
Right.
There feels like there's something wrong with that, right?
Yeah.
Whereas it doesn't feel like there's anything wrong with that when it comes to a vacation. That difference is when you feel that difference, you're feeling the difference of an untimely question and a timely question.
Okay. Yeah. I kind of makes sense in my brain. So why did Socrates pursue, I guess, inquiry or asking things in ways that others wouldn't? Like for his contribution, what was his kind of difference here?
I think first and foremost is that he figured out how to do it. No one else had. So he just developed a method for inquiring into all these questions. So if you imagine that Socrates is like Tolstoy, right? That he's beset by these really big questions, that he thinks they're really significant, that he finds that he doesn't make any progress in them thinking by himself. But then he figures out, oh, wait a minute, there's a trick to this. You just need to get someone else into the picture. And then suppose you were then to ask, but why does he do it? It's like, well, he found a solution to life's biggest problem, so he took the solution. And I think Socrates' point of view is that anyone who doesn't do it, it's just because they don't get that this is the solution to this really big problem. That, which is to say, everyone who fails to do this, the only reason they're not doing it is ignorance.
Let me ask it a little bit, kind of in my world a bit. So a lot of people, I'm not a strict kind of CBT guy. It's a kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. I mean, I've used elements of it, trained in it, but I'm not I'm not a loyalist to it necessarily. But one
Mhm.
of the nice contributions that is used, at least in a clinical kind of context, is the Socratic method, right? Aaron Beck has this whole Socratic method, downward arrow. You basically just keep asking the question. So the clinician, therapist, psychologist is asking the client, well, you're saying that you're, feeling very negative about this, or you feel sad about this. What's about that? What can you tell me about that experience? What was happening? Okay, and then you keep following it. Okay, so this person hurt your feelings. What was it about, or whatever? And you just keep kind of
Yeah.
asking downward. I'm not doing the best
Mhm.
example of this, but but you do this kind of Socratic method. I mean, how does that? Do you feel? Obviously, philosophy in some sense has a different. Just bear with me here. It has a sort of different agenda than like what a clinical setting would have. With there's a sort of different agenda there. Perhaps maybe there's some overlap there. I guess how do you see either in this context clinically or in other contexts, people using the Socratic method in other arenas outside of, strict philosophy, but even if you just see as a way of life in other places like a clinical arena or other places, how do you see different places or ways people use the Socratic method? Is it very kind of malleable and people can use it in different ways? Or do you think there's a kind of more or less the Socratic way of doing that? How Socrates did it and that's how it should be. What do you think about how it's used?
So first of all, I do find it actually really interesting that the Socratic method is used in therapy, and I think it is in lots of different kinds of therapy. Actually, I think it's
Yeah,
also
yeah.
like lots of the place I'm more familiar with is in sort of psychoanalytic theory
Mm-hmm.
that
It's there too.
understands itself as well as being Socratic. I think that the biggest difference between the Socratic method as used by Socrates and the Socratic method as used by therapists is that when Socrates uses it, it's important that there are um, two desires on the scene. That is, both people desire to know something. Um, like if you and I are inquiring together about virtue, it's relevant, it's crucial that we both want to know what virtue is.
Mm-hmm.
But and we're each free in some sense to let our interest in virtue guide the conversation. I think the therapist is not really allowed to have their own desires to know show up in the conversation, right? The point for them is to do whatever helps the patient. And so the fact that they happen to be curious, say, about does it matter that the therapist actually wants to know why did your father do this? No. The therapist is not supposed to foreground their own intellectual desires in therapy. That would be bad therapy. In like Freudian psychoanalysis, there's like a little bit of room for that in terms of countertransference. But like
Right.
basically even that is supposed to be sidelined, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in some way, therapy really tries to take the Socratic method and make it as much like about one person as possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's sort of a way that I understand what
Mm-hmm.
therapy is. It's like a
Mm-hmm.
one person Socratic method, but with two people there. Um, and and I think that's a really profound difference. And that it's really significant when both people have a desire to know and both people are like, no, this conversation isn't answering my needs. I have intellectual needs. There are things I want to know. And I'm holding you to the standard of meeting those needs.
Mm.
So, like, for example, I can much more easily, I think AI is going to be able to be your therapist way before it can be your philosophical interlocutor. For this reason, it may not be able to be your therapist for a really long time either. I'm just saying
Mm-hmm.
this is
Mm-hmm.
a really big problem for having AI as a philosophical interlocutor because we have to get all the way to the AI having desires,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's like a really long way away.
Mm.
Whereas in therapy, the therapeutic context already required the therapist, in some sense, to dehumanize themselves. That is, to subtract their own desires from the scene. And so they've taken a few steps towards AI already.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I like the distinction you made. I've never heard someone explain it that way, and that resonates very well. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I'm more psychodynamic myself as well. And you do have a space of transference, countertransference, and you use the countertransference. So where the therapist has, some kinds of things that are being reminded of them in their unconscious in the client and things like that, and the transference is on the client side. but you're supposed to appropriately, use that where it's not the focus, right, is on the therapist, it's on the person. So yes, it is the very one-sided thing. Although there's maybe a little bit of that you can be useful, but the goal and the mindset is always for the one person. It's not a reciprocal kind of thing, which makes sense in what you're saying in differentiating between how the Socratic method is. Would you say maybe this isn't right. So you tell me if I'm wrong on this, but if you're in a Socratic dialogue or with somebody, is it a type of, I don't want to say relationship, but is it a type of connection? Maybe that's a kind of, you are two people's desires are kind of interacting or interchanging. And there's a connection, a kind of intimacy, or intellectual intimacy, if you will, or a sharing there. Is that too deep, or am I reading too much into it? What do you think there?
No, I mean, I think that, at some point Socrates characterizes that as the fundamental erotic connection between human beings. So he definitely thinks of it as going pretty deep. And, there are these moments where, like, someone who's close to him, in one case it's Alcibiades, and in another case it's Crito, says something to him to the effect that, like, show me that you really love me. Show me that you really care. And Socrates is like, okay, let's do philosophy together. And, what Alcibiades meant was like, let's have sex. And what Crito meant was like, let me bribe the jailers to get you out of jail because I'm your friend. That's what friends do. And each of them thought, look, I have this like special closeness with you that's going to translate into I get you out of jail or I have sex with you. And Socrates is like, no, the way to be close to someone is this way. And the reason he thinks that is because if you think about what being close to someone is, right, it's that in some way or other, they fulfill or answer to some need or desire that you have, right? And, you can have lots of different needs or desires that another person can answer to. Like they can bring you food, they can take care of you when you're sick, they can entertain you. But Socrates thinks, yeah, those are all needs that we have, but they're not our most fundamental need. Our most fundamental need that we have as human beings is the need to know. And it's when another human being appears in our life in that capacity, in the capacity of satisfying our need to know, that we make the most fundamental connection to them.
I agree. I'm just thinking about sort of the I guess the intentionality of it, right? Not that it's required. I'm just thinking about it kind of out loud about you. There are people consciously or unconsciously have various needs from other people, and sometimes we can't understand or know in the positive or the negative why this person is or isn't meeting my needs, but we do seek that. I mean, would you agree that that's sort of the fundamental piece of relationships? Now, in this context, it might be intellectual eroticism, but it is a way of knowing. How do I know I'm connecting with this person on we're both trying to figure out a thing either both of us don't know, or they know more, I know less, or vice versa. Is that, I'm kind of giving a value judgment here or a kind of hierarchical thing, but is that not the most intimate, well, maybe not the most, but one of the most intimate ways you can be with a person?
That's certainly what Socrates thinks. It's not what anyone else thinks. So I think he's the only one in the history of time who's ever thought that. And me, and hopefully lots of other people from now on. But
think about it. If you connect with somebody intellectually, there's almost man, it's a hard way to explain it. There's an intimacy with that you might not be able. I mean, of course, every relationship's different, but there's something powerful about connecting with somebody intellectually. And I would throw in there, because you do talk about in the book too, is involved with that is some element of our emotional life too. I mean, our intellectual life is not devoid of our affective or our emotional content, right? Whether it's manifest or latent. So it's, I guess, I don't know. I mean, look, the obvious thing that people think about is like, sex and sexual intimacy and, romanticism and, okay, that's fine. That's a way to be intimate with someone. But even if you don't have those things, I would say you could still have a very deep, powerful, intimate connection relationship with someone intellectually in this way that can rival or surpass even sexual intimacy in some ways. I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
So I think that there's an interesting thing about sexual intimacy, which is that it has this incredible promise in advance. That is, we really feel like when we sexually desire someone, we really feel like the sex is going to give us this very intense form of intimacy. And then there's often this sort of disappointment afterwards of like, oh, nothing really changed.
Mm-hmm.
Something might change in the sense that you feel in some sense now vulnerable to this person. They can hurt you in certain ways, but still it's not quite the same thing as like, now I really know them or something. And so I think one of the things I try to argue in the love chapter of my book is that there's something you're getting right in that feeling of wanting this intense intimacy by way of sex. You're having this sense that there's a special kind of communion that's possible. Mm-hmm. But Socrates thinks you're just making the mistake of thinking you're going to get that by smushing your bodies together. It's just not on offer in that way, which is not to say there's anything wrong with doing that, but it isn't going to give you, insofar as you kind of have this elevated and transcendent sort of view about sex, as many people do, whether they're willing to admit it or not. Not everyone does, but many people do. Mm-hmm. Insofar as you have that view, Socrates thinks sex isn't going to give you that. It'll give you some bodily pleasure at best. Mm-hmm. If you want that thing, I can tell you how to get it, but it's not by sex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. In large part, I certainly think that if you have both, that's a pretty powerful connection, right? Because if you're basically having you're getting the one thing that you want, certain needs or your intellectual knowledge or things like that you're doing socially with another person in an intimate way. And then you're also maybe expressing that physically. Yeah. I mean, that's the good stuff, right? That's, and maybe that doesn't always happen or whatever, but I would think that and again, that it's required or that's what Socrates is saying. But if you do have that combination, that can be a potentially powerful connection.
Socrates sort of allows for that in the Phaedrus as like, he kind of thinks of it as like the second best is the people who are sort of doing both. So he doesn't think of it as the best. He thinks the best is just the philosophy one. And you can sort of see why, right? So it's like we have this, we're very into like the symbolic meaning of sex, like as a group of people, that's like, it's very important to us culturally, right? You could be like, well, look, like it's nice to be philosophically connected to someone, but it's also good if they bring you food and you have like a food connection as well. And you might be like, well, sure. And like, it's also good if you like work together because then you have that connection as well. And you can keep throwing in connections. And in some sense, there's nothing wrong with any of them. I think Socrates would be like, there's nothing wrong with like adding more and more connections and more levels of dependency, but they don't actually get to the heart of the matter. Unless you want to say something like, look, there's some, historically and culturally contingent facts about how you have to relate to an interlocutor. For instance, are they going to be physically around or not? Mm-hmm. And some of those questions are going to be, are going to mean that having a philosophical interlocutor and having someone that speaks to some of your other needs, that those are going to go together. And I think he's fine with it if it goes together, but that's mostly like kind of an accident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are these savage commands that you talk about in the book, and how are they different from regular commands or non-savage commands? I guess you could say. And in that chapter, you talk about it in different chapters, but in the main one, you talk about the role of perception here with these commands. So what is that? Explain this for us.
So the place to start is just to notice that, like, if I'm right, that there are these untimely questions. What that means is that there's some questions where we have answers to those questions, even though we never asked the questions, right? In fact, they're really important questions. We never asked them. We just got answers. The question is, where did we get the answers? How did we magically, arrive at a bunch of answers to questions that we never took any time to ask? And the next step is to see what a command is. So let's say you ask me, what book should I read next?
Open Socrates, The Case for a Philosopher. I'm just kidding.
Well, you read that. So
I've already read
and I say, okay, read Plato's Gorgias, right? Well, what have I done there? I've answered your question, right? But let's say you didn't ask me, what should I read next? And I just said, read Plato's Gorgias. Now I've commanded you. Mm-hmm. So a command just is an answer to a question that wasn't asked. That's what a command is. Okay. So in effect, what you have, insofar as you have answers to savage commands, but you never pose the questions, are a bunch of commands. Mm-hmm. Sorry, insofar as you have answers to untimely questions, but you never pose the questions, what you have are commands. Now, I call them savage commands for a reason, which is like, say I commanded you to read the Gorgias. You could be like, but why? And I'll be like, well, let me explain it to you. I have a lot to say about why you should read the Gorgias. Okay. But our savage commands aren't like that. They don't, when you ask them, so one of our sources of savage commands is our bodies. So say you're like, I don't know what to do. What should I do? Your body will just be like, eat, or go to sleep, or get warm, right? So our bodies tell us to avoid pain, pursue pleasure, to satisfy our basic appetites, to secure the resources needed to satisfy those appetites in the future, to be afraid of death, etc., right? And they tell us those things, and when we respond, well, now is not the moment to eat, or, I think there's not really much reason to be afraid of death. Our bodies don't shut up. They don't give us reasons. They're not like, well, sit down for a minute and let me explain to you why you should actually eat, even though you think you shouldn't. It's just like eat. And I'm like, but I can't eat now. Eat. It just repeats it. So it's savage in that way. It's an inarticulate command. Just tells you what to do and won't back it up with any justification. Okay, so that's one of the two is your body. But we have another source of savage commands, and that is what I call your kinship group. Now, kinship is not a great word for the thing I want to talk about, but there's just no English word. The Greek word is philia. But I'm using the word kinship, which is typically in English restricted to family relations grounded in marriage. Mm-hmm. I'm stretching it to cover all the different groups that you belong to. So it would cover citizenship, your fellow citizens. It would cover your D&D group. Okay, my husband plays D&D. He has multiple D&D groups. It would cover like your colleagues and your work group. It would cover in the world that we live in now. One of the really distinctive features of our world is that we have non-geographic kinship groups. So like I may consider myself in a kinship group with all women, mm-hmm. or like a gay person might see themselves as a kinship group with gay people, or a black person with all black people, even though there's very little like geographic rationale to those categories. That is, mm-hmm. gay people, black people, and women are all over the world, right? Through most of human history, kinship groups were all geographically based because people did not have complicated ways of communicating across large distances. That's no longer true. Okay, so these are all kinship groups, in my view. Mm-hmm. And what your kinship groups do is they tell you what to do. So mm-hmm. they tell you how to dress, what kinds of facial expressions you can have, what kinds of emotions you can express in public, what kinds of emotions you can express in private, what holidays you should celebrate, whether God exists or not. Basically all of your habits and customs are just governed by the fact that you belong to some set of groups. And no one ever explained the rules to you. You just intuitively get them. You intuitively follow them. You're very obedient to them, very, very compliant. You're about as compliant in relation to your kinship groups as you are in relation to your body, which is pretty compliant. So these are our two main sources of savage commands, and they both have a problem associated with them. There's multiple problems, but we can focus on the problem with your body is diachronic inconsistency. So not being the same over time. So your body might be like, eat another cookie, eat another cookie, eat another cookie. So you eat another cookie, and then you have a stomachache, and it's like, you shouldn't have eaten that cookie. Right? Your body does not tell you a consistent story over time. It goes for the proximate pleasure, even though like refraining from that pleasure might give you more pleasure overall. There are sort of other problems, which is like it ignores the pleasures of other people and sets you into conflict with other people as well. But we can focus on the diachronic inconsistency one. The problem with kinship is also inconsistency, both between kinship groups. That is, you belong to many kinship groups and they don't all have the same rules. One problem. Another problem is that every kinship group allows you to flip the sign in reverse. That is, the basic rule of all kinship groups is like benefit your kinship group or at least don't harm them. But they're all also willing to be like, yeah, but if they did something bad to you, then all bets are off. Right? So that's revenge. So revenge is the characteristic way in which the kinship command malfunctions. That is, it tells you to harm your kin instead of the normal thing, which is supposed to help them. And weakness of will, where you you think you should do something else, but you do the thing you think you shouldn't do. That's the way in which the bodily command malfunctions. That is, your body is directing you to harm your body. And so this is sort of Socrates' critique of these two commands, is that they malfunction. That is, they don't actually produce the benefits that they tout. The body is not good at protecting the body. The kin are not good at protecting kin.
What do we do with these things? What do we do with these savage commands, right? I mean, Socrates has a few things to say about that, right? Like, what do we do with them?
Yeah, well, it might be interesting. Before we look at what Socrates has to say, what I do in the book is look at what a bunch of other people had to say after Socrates. So what Socrates had to say is, these things suck, let's find something else. But what some of the thinkers after Socrates said is like, well, not so fast. What if we kind of clean them up a little bit? Right? So what if we took the bodily command, which basically tells you to pursue pleasure and avoid pain, and what if we included in it a kind of hedonic calculus where you didn't just pursue the thing you want at the moment, but whatever is going to be more pleasant overall? And what if we also sort of insisted, we'll stop there, right? So that view, the idea that like pursue pleasure, but not necessarily the biggest immediate pleasure, that's ancient Epicureanism, right? So these are a set of Epicurus and his followers were philosophers that lived in the Hellenistic period, after Plato and Socrates. And they were, in effect, trying to rehabilitate the bodily command into a less contradictory form. Quite a while later, in the 19th century, a bunch of philosophers in the United Kingdom took some further steps to rehabilitate the bodily command. They're called utilitarians. So John Stuart Mill is the main one, but Bentham and Sidgwick, we can add them in as fellow travelers. And they were people. I mean, they described themselves as modern day Epicureans. And what they said is, the Epicureans they took one step, but we got to take a few more steps. For instance, we got to include everybody's pleasure and pain. So I'm not just maximizing my own utility, but I ought to maximize the utility of everybody. That view then gets further developed in, let's say, past people like Peter Singer, but also, people who are more broadly identify as consequentialists, who are like, look, maybe we're not maximizing pleasure or utility, maybe we're maximizing something else, but we got to maximize something, whatever that thing is. We just do as much of that as possible. So all of those people are working out a strand of thought that started with Socrates, and they're trying to iron out the kinks in the bodily command. There's the second strand, which comes, so the Hellenistic version of it is Stoicism. So Stoicism is an attempt to iron out the kinks in the kinship command. So the Stoic ideal is the ideal that says that you're supposed to not see yourself as especially tied to your family or your friend group. You're supposed to see yourself as kind of a citizen of the world. And that the fundamental way that you should understand yourself is that you're sort of governed by universal laws. Laws that govern the kind of thing you are. That is the kin, the group that you belong to. So it's an abstractified version of the kinship command. And then in the 18th century, Immanuel Kant, who basically also says the same thing that the utilitarians say, I mean, I'm a modern day Stoic, kind of takes that a few steps further. And he makes the he says, look, you should see yourself as though you were a member of a notional, universally legislating kingdom of ends, right? That is, you're in a theoretical society, like in an invisible polis of people who give themselves laws. And that's the kin group. That's your only real kin group. And just behave as though you're a member of that kin group. That's Kantianism, basically. Okay, so if you want to say what can be done with these two commands, these are some pretty amazing answers. That is, I think these answers sort of are a really good demonstration of philosophy really does make progress. That is, philosophy has taken these kind of incoherent impulses and through reasoning them through has transformed them into something that is much more coherent, much more systematic, the possibility of a possible basis of an ethical theory. And that was all done through thinking and reasoning by intellectuals. It's like some of the biggest and most obvious evidence of philosophical progress for me is that thread coming out of Socrates. Okay. Of course, Socrates didn't know about any of that because it didn't happen when he was around. He didn't think of the possibility of like cleaning up or purifying these commands. He just thought, this is garbage. Let's do something else. And so what he thought was like, well, look, instead of just like being commanded, how about we don't be commanded? And how about we just actually ask the questions and figure out what the answers are and then do what we know is right? So he's proposing an alternative path that just sort of bypasses the commands altogether. And that's the path that I'm sort of describing and defending in the book.
Is this lead to, you mentioned it in the book, which I thought was nice, where you talk about how we have a Kantian ethics, we have a Aristotelian ethics, we have utilitarianism, which you explained. And does this kind of lead to Socratic ethics, right? Is this kind of where this leads to? Say Absolutely. More about this. He wants to bypass the commands. How does he build on a kind of ethical, if you will, system, I guess, of sorts? Or how does he do it?
So maybe it's worth adding in because I gave you the utilitarian line and I gave you the sort of Stoic Kantian line, but I didn't give you the Aristotelian line, which is a third pathway.
I do like Aristotle's ethics, so I'm curious to see where you see the differences here.
Yeah. So Aristotle thought, in effect, the Epicureans and the Stoics, what they're doing is taking one of the two commands and polishing that one up and kind of ignore the other one. So the Stoics are famously kind of looking down on the body, and the Epicureans are sort of famously sort of apolitical. What the Aristotelians, their thought was, look, maybe we can fix these two things by tethering them to one another. That is, by making the bodily command and the kinship command one command, and then by being suspect of any kind of command that doesn't involve an overlap between the two, you can sort of tame it. That's the Aristotelian way of taming it. And the way that the Aristotelians do that is through the concept of the kalon, which is like the noble or the beautiful or the fine. It can be translated any one of those ways, and none of them, you need all three kind of. But the point is, what the kalon, what the beautiful is it's going to be something where it's noble in the sense that it is beneficial for people around you. So everything that's kalon is good for your society, right? But it's beautiful to you, so you take pleasure in it, right? You see it as beautiful. And so it's both the highest source of pleasure and the highest source of good for the group that you're in. And so you can pursue that in a unified way. And that's the sort of Aristotelian hope. It is predicated on a theory of habituation, which is the process by which you bring these two commands into line, right? They're not naturally aligned with one another. And Aristotle's very clear, virtue is not ours by nature. It's not a natural thing, because naturally these things actually pull apart. But you can sort of use a certain kind of moral education to like bring them into line. So if you're in a good society and you had a good education, and most importantly, you had good laws, then you can kind of get these two commands both not to contradict themselves and not to contradict one another. That's Aristotelian ethics. Okay. You're still just obeying savage commands. Aristotle would say, well, they're not so savage because now they're, they've been modulated a little bit, right? But I think that's what the Kantians and the utilitarians would also say. They're not savage anymore because we've infused them with reason in a certain way, which is fair enough. I think they could say that. I think that Socratic ethics is really different from any of these three because it really does say, like, no, just don't listen to any of the commands. A simple solution, just ignore all of it. Don't try to harmonize them. Don't try to polish them up. Just toss them in the trash and just try to figure out how you should live. And so Socratic ethics, I do think, is a form of ethics. It is the potential basis of a system, just like Kantianism, Aristotelianism, and utilitarianism. It gives you a different target than these other ethics. So the target of Kantian ethics is respecting the dignity of every rational being, like that. The target of utilitarianism is maximizing utility, happiness, whatever. So those are different targets, right? Utilitarianism and Kantianism tell you to pursue different things, because they're different ethical theories. Aristotelianism tells you, like, pursue the noble, or alternatively, same thing, exercise the virtues. Okay, so yet a different target. Socratic ethics gives you the target, pursue knowledge. That's the point of life. That's what your goal is supposed to be in life, is to get knowledge. And so everything about Socratic ethics is going to be driven by that difference in goal, just like everything about the structure of those ethical theories is driven by what they think of the goal as. And so what I try to do in the last part of the book, because you might say, okay, but how does that actually concretely become an ethical theory? And that's what I try to show you in the last part of the book. I'm like, well, look, to see where it's an ethical theory, let's start with where are the problems in human life? Like, where do we falter? Where do we struggle? And, Socrates has an answer to that question: love, death, politics. That is, these are the areas where he thinks human beings are just characteristically at sea. We're just very, very lost. Not like how to get food. There's a lot of things we know we're good at, we know how to do, but these are three things we don't know how to do, Socrates thinks. And he's right. He's still right. It's still true that we don't know how to do those three things, in spite of the fact that we've made incredible progress since his time on a lot of fronts, but we have not made much progress on those three fronts. And what I try to do is say, look, if you're Socratic, here's what you're going to do in relation to these three things. That is, it's gonna make a difference that you're pursuing knowledge instead of pursuing some of the other things you could be pursuing. And so that's sort of, I try to show there how Socratic ethics is an ethical theory that can actually guide your life.
So the underlying principle for Socratic ethics really is this epistemological question, to know. How do we know things? How do we know stuff? But isn't there a sort of, like, there's a purpose, right? Because most people would say, like, well, the good, the noble, the welfare of others, maximizing potential, those all have intention or purpose or things like that. Just knowing stuff, how could that have purpose, I guess, I'm giving the kind of, critique of this of sorts. Like,
yeah,
what would you say about that?
Right. So it's not knowing just any old thing. It's knowing answers to untimely questions, right? Where those answers are answers about how you should live your life. But let me explain why those answers are important to know. It's not just because you'll make the wrong decisions with that's also important, but fundamentally. So say that you could live the rest of your life and you would behave in all the same ways that you would otherwise behave. There's one change, which is that you're not going to be conscious for any of it. So other people will believe you're conscious because you're going to act just like you would have acted had you been conscious. So we're imagining sort of zombie Javier. If you could have this choice of live the rest of your life as a zombie versus as a non-zombie, and you would do all the same things, and everyone would have all the same beliefs about you, they wouldn't know that you're a zombie. I assume you'd pick non-zombie. That is, it would matter to you to be conscious for the rest of your existence rather than to not be conscious. At least most people would pick that. Right, let's presuppose for a moment, and that we can go back to that premise, right? But I'm going to use that. I'm feeling.
What's it called? Contrarian at the moment, but I'll go with it. Yes, I'll.
Okay. So I think for Socrates, the knowledge, the understanding of why you're living your life the way you do, stands to the living of your life. Much as most of us, the consciousness stands to living of your life. That is, the reason you might give for not picking zombie Xavier is that it's like, but then it's not me living my life. If I'm a zombie, it's not really my life. I'm not like having the life if I'm a zombie. And Socrates is like, but that's exactly what it is like to go through your life without knowledge. It's not really your life. You don't know what you're doing. A bunch of stuff is happening, but it's not sort of deeply grounded in your own mind. Your mind is not governing the things that are happening. And like consciousness, from Socrates' point of view, is not that important. Knowledge, that's actually really important. It's really important that your life be a manifestation of you, and what you are is your mind. And so that's why knowledge is so important, because then you get to have a life.
Well,
as opposed to just an imitation of a life, like what the zombie has.
But it's still a life. Because you don't know it doesn't mean it's not a life. You just don't know it.
I think it'd be fair to say that the zombie life is not a life. It looks like a life. It could fool other people into thinking it was a life, but it's not a life. And the reason it's not a life is the absence of a certain kind of knowledge.
I mean, yes, I agree with you. But just for the sake of argument, I do wonder. Yeah. Because, I mean, how much of our stuff that we have, well, maybe this is to the point, how much of things that happen to us in life we don't know, right? Like, we don't know, like, for example, like, I don't know the next sentence I'm going to say. I don't know what I'm going to do later tonight. I might think I know, right? But I don't actually know. So much of our life is unconscious. And then it rises to consciousness, and we don't know how it gets there and all these things and whatever. But it doesn't mean that because whether something is consciously aware or we're unconscious about it, it doesn't mean that we're not living a life. It just means that there are some things that we are aware of what we're living. And yes, maybe there is a type of illusionary kind of way of moving through things. So if you have the chance to know, I still think it's sort of a value judgment of saying like, well, it's better to know than to not know. And I'm fine with that. But I do think it's not maybe so pure to say, well, it's better to know than if you don't. You don't want to be a zombie because then that's not really you. And I would say, well, how would you know it is or it isn't if you're not conscious of it? I guess you
wouldn't know it when
you wouldn't know it. Right, you wouldn't know.
That doesn't mean we should ask that person. That person's a zombie, so we don't need to ask them anything.
But isn't there a value there though? Right? Okay, let me say it this way. I'll broaden it. Isn't with all ethics, you are placing maybe the target thing is you're placing value on that target. We think the good or the well-being of others or well-being of sentient things on the planet, or whatever maximizes things, or whatever we know, we're placing a value on that. And I'm not saying that's again right or wrong. That's a different question. But I guess it is kind of baked into it, no?
So, I think that so like you might be reasoning backwards. It's sort of like, but look, we just don't know a lot of things, and so it must be okay not to know because that's the situation we're in. And I think there Socrates is like, no, you might actually be really screwed is a possibility that we should have on the table, right? Okay, that's the first thing to say. Second thing to say is, I think that, you might think, it seems like we're okay with not knowing stuff. And Socrates is like, well, you're okay with not knowing some things, like what am I going to do later today? That's a timely question. And you can tell you're okay with not knowing it because you can say to yourself, what should I do later? That's fine. Because your whole sense of having any purpose in life is not resting on that question. But if you ask yourself something like, am I a decent human being? Everyone has to cling to the thought, I have an answer to that question. And it's like a good answer, even though they've never really dared to pose the question to themselves. Their life is resting on something that is like a shaky foundation. And they themselves would grant that their life is resting on it. That is, they themselves would say, look, if I'm not a decent person, then maybe my life isn't worth living. But if you don't know you're a decent person, then we can at least say you don't know your life's worth living.
Yeah, I see that. I do still kind of wrestle with the weight or the values we place on certain things over other things, which is, again, I think it's fine. I just wonder why we make those decisions. I mean, there are certain things that I mean, you're right. The untimely questions are important, but I don't know. I wonder how much of our Bayesian priors come in here and all these things like that. Like, how are we pushing these things into something to say like, well, I want to know if I'm a good person. I want to know if I'm not, racist, sexist, bigoted, right? Those are important, right? Those are important things. But even in that question though, is like, I'm making a kind of almost decision. Like, I don't want to be those things. And even if I am, yikes, but I don't know. I guess I just think about it that way. I mean, again, I don't disagree with the project that Socrates is doing with his ethics. I mean, that's how ethics are. But I wonder about it. That's all.
Right. So I think that, one thing I hear in this is the thought like, we could be going quite wrong in terms of what we think the significant ethical questions even are, and like how we're framing what it is to be a good person. We might be putting too much weight on some things rather than other things. Socrates agrees with all that. He thinks like that, yeah, exactly. And like, you're not going to figure out whether you did or not unless you inquire. There's not some other thing where you're just going to get hit in the head with the truth. That's never going to happen. You're going to actually kind of have to roll up your sleeves and like figure out like, how important is it to not be sexist? I live in a world that's like kind of echoing very, very loudly like that's like the worst thing to be. But that's just the kinship command at the moment. That's the tune everyone's singing at the moment. Is it really true? Will humanity maybe turn around on sexism and embrace it in 20 years? Like, right? The philosopher wants to actually know the answer rather than just echoing the voices around her.
Yeah. I like that. Okay, 2 final questions. One's a absolutely impossible question for you to ask in such a short time, but it is interesting, and I'm only bringing it up a little bit. You can just give us a sample of it, of so much now with many things in life. So this is maybe a little bit more practical, so you can pull it in here, is we keep saying we want to know the truth, right? People look online, they look at what, politicians are saying or not saying, how they're lying, how they aren't, misinformation, disinformation, things on social media, all these things. And you say that pursuing truth is implying courting falsehood, which, seems, kind of interesting there. What does, I guess, Socrates tell us about truth? I mean, again, that's a huge question. Everyone's been asking this for thousands of years, but I guess you're kind of, again, small appetizer for that of like, how do we have those two things there of like the falsehoods and the truth, and like how there's sort of a relationship there? How do we navigate that?
Socrates noticed that what we want is knowledge, not truth, but knowledge. That is, there are many truths that you might be able to know and like, but you wouldn't have justifications. You wouldn't be sure that the truth, they might not be important, right? So we want something a little more elevated. But in order to have knowledge, you have to at least have true belief, right? And you have to avoid having false belief. That's like clear, right? So truth is a necessary condition for sure. And avoiding falsity is a necessary condition. And you might just think, well, truth, avoiding falsity, those are the same thing. And it turns out that they are the same thing in retrospect. That is, if you have a truth, if you have some truth, then you have avoided falsity a fortiori about that thing, because you don't believe the other thing, you just believe the true thing. But if you think about it prospectively, say there's like two claims, like, I'm asking myself, is X, Y, yes or no? For instance, does honey spoil? Yes or no? I suppose I'm not sure. But let's say I really want to have a truth. That is, it's really important to me to like have some truth. Well, then I should just guess one or the other, because if I don't guess, I have no chance of having a truth, right? But if I at least guess, I at least have a 50% chance that I have a truth. So if my goal is having a truth, then I should be credulous and I should always form a belief one way or another. If my goal is to avoid falsehood, however, I should never form any beliefs. That is, I should suspend judgment about everything all the time, because then I can 100% be sure that I've avoided falsehood. You have a surefire way to avoid ever believing anything false. Don't believe anything. Then you've avoided falsehood decisively. So what you can see here is that these two rules, pursue truth and avoid falsehood, actually stand in tension with one another. The more you feel like, look, in order to move ahead in my life, I need to have some beliefs or other. I just need to have some shot at truth. Then I'm going to take some risks. I'm going to believe some things where I might not have the best evidence for them. In order to be like, look, I'm going to make sure my beliefs are totally kosher and I'll only believe on the strictest evidence, then I'm just like not going to have a lot of beliefs and I'm going to mostly suspend judgment. And those are the two really different roads that you can take. And Socrates tells us it's a big problem because he's like, the problem here is that pursue truth and avoid falsehood are rules that pull you apart, but you actually really do have to follow both of them in order to get knowledge. And if one person can't follow both of them, what are we going to do? I frame this in terms of William James's Ethics of Belief, where he's pitting himself against William Clifford. William Clifford's basically like the just avoid falsity guy, and James is like, sometimes you got to have truths. And the way James thinks about it is like, look, sometimes we go with the one, sometimes we go with the other. Socrates is like, that is not how you get knowledge. How you get knowledge is you got to follow both these rules completely, 100%, at the same time. And one way to understand the Socratic method is just, it's a way of doing that. Because one of the people is tasked with being in charge of the have truths role. Namely, they're the person who's answering the question, the person Socrates is talking to. So Socrates is like, what does virtue mean now? And Meno gives an answer and it's not good. And then he's got to give another answer and it's not good either. And then he's got to give another answer, right? And if you're the person Socrates is talking to, you're supposed to answer. Even if you don't know the answer, even if you're not sure, you got to give some answer or other. You got to spit something out and you got to be confident about it and you got to like be ready to defend it. So you're the have truths guy. And then Socrates is the other guy. Socrates is the avoid falsity guy, where his idea, you give this answer and he's like, well, I'm not sure I want to accept that. Here's my problems with that, right? So he's going to be the guy who raises the problems, who makes objections. He's following the rule to avoid falsity. Now, a lot of times Socrates is confused with skeptics. Okay, so that was another Hellenistic school, was the skeptics, and they saw themselves as being the followers of Socrates, but so did the Stoics. So did everybody but the Epicureans. So the skeptics were like, we're just not going to believe anything. We'll be safe because we won't believe anything. That was not Socrates' approach. Socrates thought, look, this skeptical thing that I'm doing is productive if there's somebody doing the other thing, right? The point is not just like avoid having any beliefs in life because then you don't have knowledge and I want knowledge. The point is play the role of the skeptic together with somebody who's playing the role of the dogmatist. And then the two of you can make progress together. And that's what Socratic inquiry is.
Yeah, nicely said. Yeah. Does honey spoil? I'm going to guess yes.
Not. In fact,
it doesn't?
It never spoils, like not after like 1,000 years, no. It's a fun fact about honey. It does not spoil.
I'm going to do a deep dive on that later tonight. Okay, final question. You wrote such a great book on Socrates and many of the truths and ethics that he's looking for and all these things. What is, or how can, I guess, Socrates teach us how to have or how to live a philosophical life in the 21st century? We're a quarter of the way through the 21st century. How is Socrates still relevant to live a philosophical life now?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'll give sort of two answers. It's like one answer is contained in my book, which is to say, what I try to do in the last third of the book is to pinpoint areas that the reader will find perplexing in their own lives. Hopefully, at least one of these will be a source of perplexity for the reader, either their love life, their orientation towards death, or their engagement with politics. And what I try to show you is that if you take that part of your life and you look at it in a Socratic way, a lot of the puzzles and confusions that you have about it go away. I call this the Socratizing move. What I say is that sort of applying Socratic thinking to these problem areas of your life kind of sheds light on what you were really after. So we got into that a little bit with love, right? Where like maybe the deepest connection that we're really looking for is an intellectual connection. That's one of the lines of thought there. In politics, what I say is that like, we engage in all this kind of ugly political fighting, but that's really just like a pantomime of arguing. And what we're trying to do is argue publicly with one another. And that's what we're failing to do. So that if you got this Socratic angle in view, all of a sudden you see what we're after, what we're trying to do. Okay, so that's how I do it in the book, to try to sort of show you that the Socratic model like sheds a certain light on what you're doing and gives you a certain structure and helps you see what are the good parts, what are the bad parts, how can I get closer to this ideal. But I myself feel, coming off of writing this book, dissatisfied with the amount of guidance that it provides the reader. So a way to think about this book is that it really shows you what our target is. And it tries to make a case that that is our target. But that's not the same thing as telling you what are the first steps you could take now. I'm writing another book about that.
I was going to say, where's the sequel?
So I'm basically writing a book that starts with the reader where we are now, at our current historical moment, and in particular with a lot of attention to the kind of the feeling of like being alienated, being lost, being confused about value that I think characterizes our moment and has done so since around 1900. That is, this book is like heavily influenced by literary modernism, which I think gave voice to a certain kind of, like, if you know that Munch painting, The Scream, I think that's a painting version of a lot of these literary texts that are written by people like Joyce and Pessoa and Bruch and Musil and Kafka and Virginia Woolf. And there's a whole generation of writers who were just like, who saw something horrifying about the human condition. And I think we're still there. And I want to try and explain what that is and sort of how to engage with it, how to deal with us as we stand. But that's my next project.
There's some Nietzschean overtones there too, as well as
absolutely. Nietzsche was big among all those writers.
Yeah,
not all, but the Austrian ones. He was big among the Austrian ones.
yeah, that's great. Well, Agnes, this was so much fun. You're a joy to talk to. I really enjoyed it, and you're welcome here anytime anytime you want to talk more about all these things. And I really, really appreciate you giving me your time and wisdom and energy. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was fun.